There he is! Alrighty everyone, hello, and welcome back to an episode of My Nonsense, and absolutely also an episode of B-Lock's Nonsense. B-Lock, who just discovered the new broom that I bought, and has been very happily flirting with that over there, and who's also angry that I'm once again sitting in his special chair. I'm not allowed to be in this chair. This is apparently now his chair, and he will fight me to the death for it. Humblebee! Oh my god. We got a fun topic today. Anyway, we are talking about Christian Wicca, which is different than Christian witchcraft, and we're talking about this at the request of a few folks who wanted me to dig a little bit into it. Now, this is going to be a video that has to go a little bit into Wicca, in which I may have to amend some of my previous statements about it based on new information I have learned about it. But before we get into all that, hello, my name is Sara Rastres, and I am a Christian witch, not a Christian Wiccan, and I am also a writer, an educator, a content creator, and very specifically a writer of this book right here, Discovering Christian Witchcraft. And if you were confused about how one could be a Christian witch, specifically a Christian who practices witchcraft, then this book is going to be the one that kind of demystifies that for you. The one that's going to talk about what all these Bible verses you're no doubt Googling right now actually have to say on the topic, and which also tells you a little bit about very basic witchcraft tools, methods, the crisscross of modern neo-pagan holidays with Christian holidays, the historical background of all these kinds of things, and a lot more. And we also have the sequel to that book coming out in less than 2 months. Discerning Christian Witchcraft, the sequel to Discovering Christian Witchcraft, comes out on December 30th, 2025. And that one goes a lot deeper into the kind of underwire, the meta of what makes Christian witchcraft work, specifically with mysticism. If you are not interested in grabbing a book yet though, totally get it, totally understand. All you have to do in that case is go ahead, like the video, hit the subscribe button, and ring the bell, because we do post a video here every single Friday. And better yet, if you want to get these videos 2 weeks early and ad-free, all you have to do is subscribe to my Patreon. Everything in the $10 tier and up gets you these videos and a whole lot more every single week. I post quite a bit of shit on Patreon. Y'all really should be checking that out, because there's a lot of good stuff on there. I spend a lot of time on that bitch. So, I actually this week read this book right here about Christian Wicca. And it's one that, was recommended that I should check out, see if there's like any overlap and what's going on with that. And I gotta say, I was actually surprised with what I learned both about Wicca and this kind of space. I was surprised to see how much overlap there is between Christian Wicca and just Christian witchcraft, which are two different things. And it also kind of got me diving into a little bit more, just a little bit more, about some questions I had about Wicca, right? Because one of the things you hear about the Wiccan religion is that it is a fat mess of cultural appropriation and disaster, and that is something that I also believed for a long time and have recently eased up on, because I have, been exposed to other folks who said, no, that's not quite right. Wicca does have its own tradition and its own format and its own everything like that. It wasn't until later that it became the mess that people think it is today, which fair enough. What I know about Wicca off the bat is that it was mostly started, like the actual religious tradition tenet we understand today was started by Gerald Gardner, who in the last century really wrote a lot of books, solidified some concepts about like the actual rites and traditions and other stuff like that around this faith tradition, this whole religious practice, and that it is based off reconstruction of the old ways, right? The old ways usually referring to, especially in this context of the people who solidified it, mostly like British, Anglo-Saxon / Celtic, neo-pagan reconstruction movements. The problem with Wicca and any neo-pagan reconstruction movement, be it Norse, be it Germanic, be it Slavic, be it anything, is that we don't have an unbroken line of pagans, right? We don't have an unbroken line of paganism anywhere in Europe that hasn't been either heavily influenced by Christianity and Christians in the area, or has not just been absolutely broken by, the official political conversions of an entire country, an entire tribe. Why you even, man? Why are you even man? So, I mean, really, right off the bat, anything I could say about Wicca, I would have to say about virtually any other pagan reconstruction movement, which I do. I do think, and I will look at a lot of neo-pagan reconstruction movements with a little bit of a, just like a little bit of a, not because I don't think there's value in trying to revive ancient pagan practice, not because I don't think that paganism is good or that old gods and old faith systems should not be preserved. I absolutely respect and admire people's constant attempts to revive these ancient faiths, to bring back these ancient practices. The reason I get a little about it is because usually these movements come with a just boatload and a half of like ahistoricism and goofiness and nonsense that doesn't help the people getting into this religion any more than whatever usually non-denominational branch of Christianity they were deconstructing out of, you know? The idea that Christians stole all the holidays, right? The idea that you know, the gods are in these strict set pantheons, or that, you know, if you don't believe in the same version of this god as someone else, that you're wrong, or this idea that Odin and Woden are the exact same god, like all these kinds of things, right? Goofy ahistoricism that really does injustice to the actual breadth and depth and diversity of how, even village to village, you could have very different ideas about divinity, deity, and all these other things. So, bringing that back to Wicca though, Wicca was started by Gerald Gardner, and it very specifically draws off like that kind of British folklore, Celtic folklore, and I think that's why you see a lot of like old school Wicca books. They do deal a lot with like that kind of more Celtic-ish bend to it than you'll see in a lot of other things. And I think one of the defining features of Wicca is that it does have a god and it does have a goddess, right? A lord and a lady in that duality, kind of that balance, right? Especially for a while, there was a lot of focus on gender binary. There was a lot of focus on, you know, certain things, and you'll hear a lot of sucky stuff about certain types of Wicca. For instance, Dianic Wicca, named after the goddess Diana. You'll hear that this sect has a lot to do with like, not quite misandrist, but very like woman-focused, woman-heavy cult initiations, and therefore sometimes that has a tendency to get members of this specific branch of Wicca a little transphobic. If you think that trans women are not women and are in fact men, you're not going to let them into that Dianic coven, which obviously is problematic for a billion and two fucking reasons. But right, generally Wicca's got that kind of thing going on. They've got the god and the goddess. They've got a lot of specific traditional tools like the thame, ritual dagger, the chalice, the cup, right? Both of these which kind of represent the genitalia of the god and goddess, as far as I'm concerned, from what I've read from this book, what I gleaned from this, which we'll get into, right? The more phallic sword, the more uterine-like chalice, that kind of thing. There's also the pentacle, there's also the wand, right? You know, the typical stuff that you're going to see pretty much virtually in any kind of magic, established stuff that has become canon in any kind of witchcraft practice at this point. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that Wicca was a hotbed of appropriation. At least it wasn't supposed to be. And I'm going to kick it to one of my mutuals on TikTok, Thumper Forge. They have a very interesting collection of information about Wicca, which also gives you many names and many leads to look into yourself. If you want to look into any of these names, if you want to look into any of this history yourself, my goodness, Thumper does not shy away from giving us all these detective points to look into, all these different names, right?
I am so glad somebody brought this up, because if we make a couple of left turns, we can segue into a conversation about cultural appropriation within Wicca, which I have been dying to talk about. So in 1939, Gerald Gardner joined the Rosicrucian Order of the Crotona Fellowship, and within the order, he met a small group of people who claimed to be practicing witchcraft and who initiated him into their practice. It's been theorized that this group was actually practicing some variation of co-masonry, and I'm not a Mason myself, so I don't really have a point of reference on that, but I do think it's a pretty workable theory. Regardless, these people introduced Gardner to the concept of venerating a goddess and a god. Please note that that is not the goddess and the god, but a goddess and a god. According to Gardner, the rituals provided to him by his initiators were fairly bare-boned, and he set about fleshing them out. Now, this is the point where people often assume that he appropriated from other cultures, but he drew almost exclusively from British folklore and from Aleister Crowley. Don't yell at me just yet, because in 1953, when Doreen Valiente was initiated into the Wicca, she pulled all of the Crowley out of the rituals and replaced it with her own original writing. And it was her original work, coupled with the framework rituals that Gardner got from his initiators, that formed the core of what became the Gardnerian tradition. Now, in The Meaning of Witchcraft, Gardner did write about the goddess and the god of the witches, and he compared them to deities from other cultures, but he also made it very clear that pantheons are very separate and distinct from one another, and that the god and the goddess of the witches were specifically Western European in origin. It was decidedly not a all gods are one god situation. It was pretty hard polytheism. So let's skip ahead to the 1980s, when non-initiatory Wicca really started getting commodified by the New Age industry. And let's look at a page from Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner by Scott Cunningham, which was published in 1988. So the third paragraph says, "Every deity that has received worship upon this planet exists with the archetypical god and goddess. The complex pantheons of deities that arose in many parts of the world are simply aspects of the two. Every goddess is resident within the concept of the goddess, every god in the god." And seriously, y'all, it was that passage, written 24 years after Gardner died and espousing a theology that was the radical opposite of Gardner's, that really opened the floodgates and allowed cultural appropriation to become a megalithic issue within non-initiatory Wicca.
Now, Scott Cunningham is the guy that wrote this Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs, and yes, this does have a very kind of like New Agey Wiccan bend to it in some of the stuff. It'd just be pulling from things that it's kind of like, okay, whatever. The only thing I do recommend anyone get that is of Cunningham, honestly, is this encyclopedia. You know, kind of developing these ideas further the way he did with Wicca is, I think, kind of where, as Thumper was saying, kind of started falling apart. But once upon a time, I mean, way back, in the past, I don't know, 75 years ago and a little bit earlier, yeah, Wicca was an initiatory-only tradition. It was something that you had to actively work into with a coven, right, and that kind of thing, at least as far as I'm aware. And it wasn't really working the way it is now, where it's basically just a fucking free-for-all. This whole idea of free-for-all Wicca is very, very new. And of course, unfortunately for a lot of us, especially anyone getting into witchcraft in the early 2000s, that's really all that was around, was this really kind of like hodgepodge fuckery of witchcraft that, you know, had the door blasted open for commercial purposes. And learning about Wicca as this more, what it became now, which is this more archetypal situation, makes a lot of things make a lot of sense. And this book on Christian Wicca we were looking at, it was published in 2003, so it's pretty old. At this point, it's over 20 years old, and it's square in that early 2000s kind of like hodgepodge fuckery type of Wicca. And so we do see a lot with archetypes here. And there's something I can appreciate about archetypes in general, right? There's something I can appreciate about the idea of like, hey, look, there is, you know, a divine feminine and a divine masculine, and blah, 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 blah. And so we're going to organize our mindset accordingly and, you know, maybe choose a paradigm or choose a system of deities that makes sense to represent that balance. Okay, sure. I would still argue that it's probably more beneficial to actually choose a specific tradition of the gods you want. Like, if you want to use Odin and Freya as your lord and lady, approaching that in a Wicca paradigm doesn't make sense to me when you could just approach it in a Norse paradigm, so I'm still kind of like, why? But when you understand that Wicca before this was actually like a little bit more specific, and that it wasn't saying that all gods are the same god, or that you can just fucking, you know, put any two deities you want in this fucking placeholder, it makes a lot more sense. It does. But again, I was always saying this makes a lot of sense. Remember when we talked about Pagan Threat by Lucas Miles? and he was fucking talking about how this one lady who wrote The Psychology of Abortion, previously The Sacrament of Abortion, how he was saying that this lady said that abortion is a sacrifice to Artemis. Right. This makes a lot more sense now, understanding that people view deities in a Wiccan framework as archetypes and not the actual gods or the actual historical practices and traditions of those gods. That makes a lot more fucking sense, because I could tell just by looking at it, right? When we talk about archetypes, we're kind of talking about Jungian psychology, which is what this psychologist was referencing. Yeah, you know, there's like archetype, like think of the major arcana in tarot, right? The magician is a certain archetype. The high priestess, the hierophant, emperor, empress. These are kind of like archetypes, right? Like these are, in tarot, these are parts of a mystical journey. Like you kind of go through the lessons of each of these stages of life as you go on, right? The hermit is a broad concept that many figures have come under, and that's why it's called an archetype, right? You have these archetypal characters who represent certain phases of life, certain lessons of life, certain modes of living. That's kind of the point. And, you know, Carl Jung was himself a spiritualist as much as he was kind of like a psychological theorist and stuff. And so he was making this stuff. He's the one that coined that whole shadow idea. When you hear people talk about shadow work, he's the one that kind of kicked that can down the road for us. And so when you think about it as archetypes, sure, you can kind of say whatever the fuck you want, I guess. And it doesn't have to be necessarily related to the actual deity. So the archetype of Artemis as hunter, but also protector of the hunted. There's that duality there that as an archetype, I guess, would make someone want to say that abortion is like a sacred right to her, when obviously the historical Artemis has no such nonsense being ascribed to her in her myths or in her ancient cultural practices. And that's kind of what that taker culture is that I think Thumper is talking about, this idea that, like, you know, you basically bust it open, commercialize Wicca, you don't make it purely initiatory and secret anymore, and therefore you can put anyone in there. You want your lady to be Hecate and your lord to be fucking Canonos, despite these gods having fuck all to do with each other? Sure, go ahead, right? It becomes this eclectic, everything but the kitchen sink type shit, and that just becomes messy. It becomes a very far cry from what Wicca actually started as, which you'll see a lot of people who say they're Wiccan but haven't initiated, haven't done nothing. You'll see that a lot of those people, again, they're following not at all the type of Wicca that it started as. So there you go. We can appreciate Wicca for being basically the kickoff, the start to a more organized approach and a more communal approach to witchcraft getting into the mainstream again, at least, if for nothing else. And also the fact that it is still a living religion, that it is still something that people practice, you know, with proper structure and rules and initiations and everything else like that. We can appreciate that. We can appreciate that. And we can also understand that the Wicca everyone's been pointing and laughing at is actually not traditional. Wicca is not the original Wicca. It is just a commercialized fuck mess, which most of witchcraft at this point has become. Anyway, all that aside, understanding Wicca now, the more newer version of Wicca, we understand now that the newer version of Wicca is very heavily kind of based around archetype, based around just general ideas of, right, Lord and Lady and that kind of balance. And also, you can really do whatever you want with Lord and Lady. So Christian Wicca wouldn't be too much outside the bounds of possibility or outside of the realm of imagination. However, as I read more about this system and read this book, here's my thing. Christian, to be Christian, assumes that Christian paradigm, whereas to be Wicca, right, assumes that Wiccan paradigm that we've all just been talking about. So when I was reading this book, I saw a lot of overlap between Christian Wicca and Christian witches, not because Christian witchcraft has anything to do with Wicca, but because the stuff that this person was drawing on was largely stuff that is already inherent in Christianity, in Christian mysticism. Stuff like Rosicrucianism, stuff like, the kind of Gnosticism, stuff like Hermeticism, and Christian Hermeticism especially, stuff like concepts, right, of the Holy Spirit as Sophia or Lady Wisdom or any of these other things. This person also says she was drawing on Kabbalah, which, again, Kabbalah is more specifically Jewish. It's not really for Christians. Christians have their own religious understanding, their own religious extrapolation of the Bible and the text within. They don't really need to rely on a Jewish paradigm of mysticism, is the thing. This is why, all talks of appropriation aside, it just doesn't really make sense to rely so heavily on Kabbalah as a Christian, because the way Christian cosmology works is at this point fundamentally radically different from Judaism, despite it branching off from that religion. So the fact that this person is just throwing Kabbalah in that fucking, soup is a little But here's my issue with this as well, is that, first of all, the book itself, this is going to make me sound like such an asshole, and I'm so sorry in advance. I'm so sorry. But if you want a book that's going to more accurately and reliably talk to you about anything that has to do with modern concepts of witchcraft and Christianity, please pick up our book. I don't say that because I want you to read mine and not Nancy's over here. I say that because as I was reading this book, we get maybe one source in the whole thing, or maybe two, where she's like, oh, according to this source and whatever, and that's really it. There's no works cited in this bitch. There is no footnote going on. There's no endnote action. There's nothing. And so, as I'm reading stuff, I'm like, okay, this is true. Another thing that she'll say 4 pages later, I'm like, holy shit, citation needed. Where did you get this information, right? So as someone who's, again, an educator, not just on the internet, but in real life, I saw this book not have any sources to back up the many, many, many claims that it made, and I said, oh, no. It also does repeat the classic, right, Christians stole pagan holidays, and blah, 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 and just complete fucking ahistoricism in there that is so common of the early 2000s, and those misconceptions around Christianity and paganism in the first place. So, this book does kind of feel also disjointed in that it just rapid fire, every paragraph just skims the ass of an entirely separate topic or conversation, and that is rough, right? Because it's you can't really keep track of anything Nancy's talking about in this book. She just moves so fast from one idea to the next, doesn't really develop a lot of ideas. But there is still, again, not everything in here is incorrect, just based on my own studies, all of which you can find in our own story. But this, again, the scholarship in here, virtually non-existent. We get a lot of researchers say, sources say, fucking who? Tell me who, Nancy. What do you mean? I want to be able to investigate these claims myself. That's why we have a fucking works cited at the end of our shit. The big value of this book for me was just understanding what Wicca really is in this more new age sense, and the more modern twist of Wicca that makes it possible for basically any deities to be shoved in here. That, again, that's not originally how Wicca was supposed to be, but now it's kind of just, it's just like a template, basically. The new taker version of Wicca, as Thumper was saying, this seems to be like a template where you can just kind of shove whatever you want in there, and it's a free-for-all, and that's where Christian Wicca makes sense. One thing, though, that I will absolutely go to bat with Nancy on, and agree with her on, though, is that why are people choosing Christian Wicca or Christian witchcraft or any of the other iterations of Christianity outside the bounds of the institution of the church? Because the church is failing people. Nancy argues this, and I agree 100%. The church as an institution, as a building, as a industry, right, as a social group, is failing people educationally, theologically, spiritually, socially, just in every way. And so young people, right? Younger people, they're deconstructing from this kind of watered down, also heavily commercialized now version of Christianity, and trying to find something that feels like home, something that, you know, helps them connect to nature and the God that made this nature and all these other things. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're doing here, right, with Christian witchcraft. We understand that the church has failed, especially as a social institution, and we are trying to essentially organize ourselves and also help reform church from the inside out in whatever chosen denominations that we have, while also creating our own organized clusters and organized spaces for fellowship and education and everything else. Absolutely. However, it is really funny to me that in some points Nancy in this book will say that, like, well, you know, church is just like too complicated, it's too full of rules, it's too full of dogma, and then she'll go into like 1,002 different things with Christian Wicca, where it's like the Sabbats, right, those kind of neo-pagan holidays, right, like the, you know, Beltane and all that kind of stuff, and Samhain and the Letha and all that. She'll go into like, oh, there's like 8 of those, and then there's also every Esbit, which is like the moons, right? The, you know, doing stuff for the moons, and then there's also Kyriets, which was really interesting to me that she would say that Kyriet from Kyrie, right? If you've ever seen the phrase Kyrie eleison, it means like, you know, Christ have mercy on me. Basically, Kyrie being like that savior kind of term. So Kyriet being basically just anything that acknowledges Jesus in some way, I think, especially when it comes to like Yule or / Christmas and things like that counts, I think, from what I understood of this book. So, okay, right, we've got all this stuff about how there's too many rules and there's too much pageantry or whatever and too much stuff and too much dogma in the church, but then, like, I look at the way that Nancy's describing Christian Wicca and it's like, this is not any easier. Girlfriend, this is actually a lot harder. Now you have a thing to do every fucking month with, like, a big ritual with the moon. You have, like, 8 holidays that are a pain in the ass to observe. You have all these ritual tools and, like, this coven setup and, like, this, like, 12-step process of doing any kind of initiation ritual and, like, make a fucking circle and all this. Oh my god. Like, let me tell you, as a Christian witch, no. As a Christian witch, fuck nah. No, dude. 55 minutes on a Sunday, and then also, like, monthly money ritual that is chill and low-key and just me communing with God. Like, it doesn't need to be fucking nuts like this. You don't need to do this. And this is really, I think, my big problem with what I understand about Christian Wicca. Again, as I said before, Christianity and Wicca are 2 separate religious paradigms, and you do not need to smash these together to get the same effect as you can in just straight up Christian witchcraft, right? And can I help you? Why are you a pain in my dick today? And actually, something that Carl McColman in the Big Book of Christian Mysticism says is, he's like, you know, it's paraphrasing him deeply here, but he says it's fucking annoying that so many people are constantly running into different types of spirituality to get what Christianity already offers. And actually, John Mabry in Growing into God has the same argument. They're both basically saying, like, hey, you don't need to go find, like, Eastern, you know, Buddhist or Hindu versions of meditation to meditate. Christian paradigm already has meditation within it. You don't need to go to these different forms of spirituality for that, like, deification or gnosis or, like, unification with God. Christianity already has long traditions of this. You don't need to go scavenge nuts and bolts from other religious systems to do that. Like, it exists already in the religion. And that's why I am very big on saying that, like, hey, Christian witchcraft is not new. Christian witchcraft, like everything I'm telling you about on this channel, in my book, everywhere, it's not new. It's been around. We are just kind of consolidating the information and making it more accessible and understandable in a modern world, in a modern lens, and really just working to break down the misconceptions around what it is and why it's called witchcraft in the first place. It's not called witchcraft because, like, hanging around a cauldron was like a standard Christian practice. It's called witchcraft today because the modern term witchcraft has changed that dramatically thanks to people like Gerald Gardner and you know, previous folks like Margaret Murray and these other people who were pointing out that Wicca is just witche, right, which is a friggin' old Anglo-Saxon term for witch, which meant seer or priestess once upon a time. It's that shift in the idea of a witch as some horrible, nasty hag out to curse your cows and shit, into the more like, hey, wait, no, this is a wise person. This is a religious leader. This is someone with a lot of spiritual knowledge and connection to the divine. That is a whole flip of the concept of witchcraft that had existed for like centuries, right? So it's the biggest fucking PR boost that any concept of magic or witchcraft could have ever had. And all it's describing is stuff that Christians have already done for centuries. Whether we're talking about imprecatory work, baneful work, like curses and stuff, whether we're talking about literally just like any kind of mysticism or anything else like that, Christians have a long, long history of already doing all this ritual. We have a chalice. It's the communion cup. We have the dagger, right? It's just like the sword of the word or whatever. We have the pentacle. That used to be the 5 wounds of Christ. And we have the wand. Jesus used to be depicted with the wand. We have these cool ass staffs, the bishop's crook. We have all these things that already exist in Christianity. You don't need to go friggin' create a new religion or a new paradigm to go get it. Christian Wicca is therefore, to me, yeah, it's a noble aim, it's a noble goal, it's the very same goal as Christian witchcraft, but they're not the same. Because witchcraft is not a religion. Witchcraft is not a faith paradigm like Wicca is. Witchcraft is just a craft. And it is a massive umbrella term under which many things fall. Let me be so explicitly clear though. Is this me saying that you cannot be Christian and Wiccan? No. In fact, there are plenty of people who do actually combine the terms Christian and Wiccan together into a workable practice all the time. One example is this creator, Daniel here on TikTok. This person does all that kind of stuff with, still following that kind of traditional Wiccan paradigm with the tools and all these other kinds of things, and following that philosophy and stuff while also still holding on to Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit, and all that. And that's fine, honestly, especially because I see Daniel talking about like Woden, Freya, all these kinds of things. To me, it really just kind of smacks of Christo-paganism, which is a similar thing, right? I mean, Christo-paganism is another one of those things that it's been around for a long time. A lot of people act like, again, they act like Wicca or, the theory behind Wicca, they act like witchcraft or Christo-paganism are new. They're not. Dual faith has existed for a long time, especially in my own ethnicity's broad group, right? I'm Slavic, specifically Slovenian. What I'm talking about goes more towards the east, towards my fiance's folk, right? Ukrainian and all that kind of stuff. So when you got like the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Eastern Catholic churches in Eastern Slavic tribes, you'll notice that, especially in the early days, it was very much like Christianity in the front, paganism in the back, right? Like it was Christian outside, it looks like a church. The second you open the door, all the Slavic pagan gods are still in there. So yeah, right? And of course you have saints being syncretized to certain gods and all these other things, which is another thing Nancy talks about, which is true, right? That saints and other such things were syncretized with pagan gods so that pagan gods could stay around and still have some influence and still be recognized in some respect. Yes, Christo-paganism has been around for a long time. The philosophies around it differ. Some people view the Christian God as just another god like any pagan god, and they go ahead with that philosophy. Some folks still view God as the one most high, and all the other gods are kind of just like smaller gods. It is entirely individual. It is entirely up to the person practicing it. And so even then, I am not Christo-pagan. I am not Christian Wiccan. I am a Christian. Full-on Christian. Theologically and all that kind of stuff. I just do witchcraft because witchcraft in the modern era really just means religious practice. It's like a hands-on religious practice. It has nothing to do with the original definitions of witchcraft that the Bible was condemning, or that people for centuries after the Bible's penning were afraid of, or were worried about, or condemned. Nowadays, the definition of witchcraft is so broad that that's why you see people go around saying that the Catholic Church is full of witchcraft, that, all this other, that Christians do witchcraft all the time when they do just basic shit that is part of any religion. Because now witchcraft just means any kind of hands-on slower, more ritualized dealings with religion or connection to a divinity. But Christo-paganism's been around for a long time. And again, Wicca, it's a separate paradigm, but you can do it. When I say like it doesn't make sense to me, that's my personal opinion. It's my personal belief that you don't need to combine Wicca and Christianity, that anything you could find in Wicca already exists in Christianity, that you don't need to throw these two things together. Even when it comes to Christo-paganism, that is not inherently Christian Wicca. These are still two different things. So to me, again, it's kind of redundant, it's kind of unnecessary, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. That does not mean you're not allowed to. Who the hell am I to say someone's not allowed to do whatever the fuck they want? That's between them and God and whoever else they might have on their spiritual team. Like, I personally don't care. It's not my business. And I wish people would have this take more when it comes to religion. Whatever you want to do, it's not my business. I am not the Knight Templar. I am not the defender of the fucking faith or something when it comes to this kind of stuff. It's not my job to defend the integrity of Christian doctrine because it can stand on its own 2 feet. And people who like plain old Christian doctrine will go get plain old Christian doctrine. And people who want to approach God in a different way will approach him in a different way. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. And if it brings people what the fruits of the Spirit are told to be, right? That patience, forbearance, gentleness, compassion, all this other kind of stuff. Great. At the end of the day, it's fine. It's okay, you know? So yeah, there are Christian Wiccans still out there. There are people who wear this title. I don't find it that's why I don't call myself a Christian Wiccan, because I don't find that necessary. I don't find that something that I need to reconcile my practice with my belief. If other people appreciate it, sure. And you know what? Actually, the more I think about it, the more I can appreciate it, because actually, one of the hardest things about witchcraft is how self-directed and open-ended it is. So if people want to get that more hands-on, direct kind of ritual experience with God, but they want, like, not that kind of stuffy church setting that freaks them out so much that they have trauma with that rubs them the wrong way to begin with, actually, Christian Wicca does, the more I think about it, make a lot of sense, because Wicca gives you that kind of witchcraft paradigm, right? That kind of magical paradigm, and also that traditional structure of magic, right? They give you like, okay, step 1, cast a circle, step 2, whatever. They give you the step by step without you having to invent it all yourself, which was what happens when you just go straight into occult science and witchcraft, like people have for centuries already, right? It gives you basically a starting point that you don't have to reinvent the wheel with. No pun intended. Again, I do still think that it's kind of like an archetype situation issue. I do think that, like, it's still kind of a far cry from the actual old school, like, original Wicca tradition. But, like, at this point, if you are doing your due diligence to respect whatever deities you have in your practice and understanding their actual roots as much as you can, and educating yourself into this actual practice, you will eventually find your way into a practice that makes sense to you, that doesn't harm indigenous groups or other peoples of which these deities belong to, and that helps you feel more connected to not only God, but by extension, your fellow man, right? God being, ironically, in this speech, a placeholder, an archetype, the source, right? God being a title for the monad, the one, the great source of all that is. And again, if you're going to read any kind of book about spirituality, please, for the love of God, before you read a single word of it, go to the back and see if it has a works cited. If there's no works cited, put the fucking book down. If there's no works cited in the book, and it's not a book that's only about, like, one person, right? Like, for instance, this book, does this have a works cited? Son of a bitch. Actually, this does. This does have notes. This actually does have notes that explain and reference other things in here, so never mind. I was going to say, unless the book is about a single figure, like, for instance, Meister Eckhart, where the bulk of what's going on here is just, like, a translation of one person's writings, don't need to worry about it. But even this has notes. Even this has notes and explanations and, like, references to the Bible and references to other you know, writings related to other Eckhart stuff. So never mind. Point is, if they're going to make claims and you're saying, what the fuck, where did this information come from? If they don't tell you where they got the information from, put the book down. Put the book down, put the book down. I have thrown books out my door for this, right? It doesn't matter how cool the information is, doesn't matter how cool the ideas are, doesn't matter how fun everything is, doesn't matter if I actually do know the references for some of the information put in there and can verify myself that I have read stuff that backs that up. If they don't tell me where their information is from, I do not trust their book, and you should not either, because that means you have no agency yourself to go investigate, and that is a problem theologically, academically, just intellectually, in terms of academic integrity. Do not trust people who don't have references to where they got their ideas from, please. But all that said, I don't know. What do you think about Wicca, about Christian Wicca? What is your experience with this? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time for some more good chats. See ya!